Hello everyone, so far 3 rounds have been played at the Superbet tournament in Bucharest, which is part of the Grand Chess Tour, a big series of tournaments featuring world's strongest players, including the new world champion, Ding Liren. Yesterday I covered a very fascinating game between Ding Liren and Ian Nepomniachtchi, which ended in a draw, but Nepo was once again very close getting a big result. Anyway, he is in the lead with 2 out of 3 so far, together with Fabiano Caruana, Richard Rapport, the second of Ding Liren, and Wesley So. And now today in the 4th round, we have the game Caruana and Ian Nepomniachtchi. So this is an interesting matchup between the two tournament leaders. Let's see what's happening in this game. Caruana opens with 1d4 and definitely he wanted to check what Nepo had prepared in one specific line. Knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, e6. We have seen this in the World Championship match. Remember that second game in which Ding Liren surprised the entire chess community here with this bizarre looking move h3. That's not what Caruana had in mind. He sticks to the main lines with the move knight c3. And now, interesting moment, because black has so many different ways of developing here. He can play bishop e7, leading to one of the main lines of the Queen's Gambit declined. Bishop b4 is the Ragozin. All of these options, they are pretty interesting. Also the move c6, transposing to a semi-Slav type of structures. Everything is possible. Now we see what Nepo had actually prepared for the World Championship match, as he goes for the move c5, leading to the semi-Tarrasch opening. White goes e3. It's an interesting way of maintaining the tension, supporting the pawn on d4, and basically anything can happen in the center. Maybe white is going to take first, black is going to take first. Different type of pawn structures may arise from this move. But black maintains the tension, starts with knight c6, and here white is the first one to release the tension. Captures on d5, c takes d5, and now black recaptures with the e-pawn, opening up the path for the bishop, so the bishop can nicely be developed later on. But white goes first for the move bishop b5, putting pressure on that knight on c6, and here black decides to take on d4. And interestingly, Caruana had this position once before in an online game in which he recaptured with its e-pawn, leading to a symmetrical pawn structure with pawns on the d-file. But this time he goes for the more ambitious move, knight takes d4. And now the pawn structure has been determined already, and you can see that black has an isolated pawn on d5, which is potentially a weakness, as it can no longer be defended by any of its other pawns. On the other hand, it also guarantees black some sort of a space advantage, because if you compare the pawn on d5 with the pawn on e3, black has a bit more space and free development. First, bishop d7 to protect the knight on c6 one more time. White castled, and now bishop to d6. All pretty standard theory. And Caruana goes for the main move, knight f3. Removing the knight from the center may look a bit odd at first, but you're threatening to take the pawn on d5. That's the main idea of dropping back with the knight to f3. Bishop e6, protecting the pawn one more time, and now white should still try to develop its remaining minor piece, the bishop on c1, so he goes b3, ready to put the bishop on the long diagonal. And black goes a6. Interesting moment as black challenges the bishop on b5. And what is white going to do with the bishop? Well, in general, I don't think black should fear this move bishop takes c6, b takes c6, because if that happens, then this pawn formation is quite nice for black. The pawn weakness on d5 is no longer there. It's nicely supported by the pawn on c6. So this looks pretty much playable for black. Therefore, the bishop is going to drop back, but the question is where. In the game, Caruana decided to come back with the bishop to d3. And now black goes knight e5. Very interesting way trying to solve the problems. You're putting pressure on the bishop, on the knight on f3, and white can no longer keep the bishop on the board, because if you do that, bishop e2, bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, bishop takes f3, And now queen c7 with a double attack on the knight on c3, as well as the bishop and queen there together attacking the pawn on h2. So Caruana goes for the move knight takes e5. Bishop takes e5. Now black does create some pressure against the knight on c3. White goes bishop b2. And now black goes rook c8, attacking the knight on c3 one more time. And there are various ways of handling this, this position. Queen d2 is looking like a very natural option, with the idea to go knight e2 next, offering the exchange of dark squared bishops. That would be quite nice for white. But black has a lot of ideas. And frankly, I believe this is still part of Nepo's home preparation. And one interesting move here could be the move knight e4. This is a very interesting idea, with the point that if you do take on e4, there is bishop takes h2. Bizarre looking move, king takes h2, and now d takes e4. And at the moment, white is a piece up. But look, thanks to that unprotected queen on d2, the bishop on d3 cannot move away, and therefore black is going to regain the piece with a more or less equal position. This didn't happen, but it illustrates how deep modern opening preparation goes these days. So instead, rook c1 is played, and black decided to castle here. And white goes for the move f4. That's a remarkable move, but white doesn't want to allow any sort of tactical ideas against that pawn on h2. If you would play, for instance, queen d2, which is an interesting move, that does allow black to simplify in the center with the move d4. And once these pawns are getting exchanged, well, the center is open, a lot of pieces will get exchanged. That's absolutely fine for black. Therefore, f4, it's move with gain of time, and the bishop will move away. The question is, where does the bishop go? Does it go back to d6 or back to c7? In the game, Nepo played here the move bishop c7, although there's also something to say for bishop d6, with the idea to meet knight e2 with queen e7. With a very solid position. I like the bishop on the board. In the game, we get to see a different approach by black, because after the move bishop c7, white decides to go for the move knight e2. Should be mentioned that knight a4 is probably even more ambitious, preventing the bishop from coming to b6. White is about to place the bishop on d4, and you see that the pieces of white, they're having quite a nice grip on these dark squares. But instead, Fabi goes for knight e2, and well, black has various ways of playing here, but bishop b6 is a natural follow-up, attacking the backward pawn on e3, but now white's idea is revealed, as he's going to offer the exchange of dark squared bishops by interfering with the bishop on d4. In the game, bishops were swapped, but in general, I believe that the more pieces are coming off the board, the easier white's position becomes, because normally when you're playing with an IQP, isolated queen's pawn, it's better to keep pieces on the board to try to generate counterplay, looking for attacking chances yourself. But now white has a very, very nice grip on the d4 square. And I don't think that the pawn on e3, it's such a weakness. It's a backward pawn which can potentially come under threat, but also black doesn't have that many pieces left to target that pawn. So therefore, if we go back, I believe that bishop d6, keeping these dark squared bishops on the board, would have been more precise. But let's see what happens in the game, because after the exchange of bishops, black is still very solid. Nepo goes for queen a5, attacking the pawn on a2, queen e2, protecting the pawn on a2, and now rook f e8. So you see that black is also trying to generate some counterplay against that pawn. And before black does get a chance to play bishop g4, white goes h3. Very useful move. And here we see that the bishop on e6 is actually not such a great piece, standing in the way of the rook. It's being hindered by that pawn on d5. So black goes for bishop d7. And now one pair of rooks is coming off the board, and white brings its queen to b2. And white is looking for ways to initiate further exchanges, but of course you don't really want to allow the exchange of that light squared bishop of black. That's black's most vulnerable piece. How should black handle this position? I believe that black is still doing fine, and after a move like queen c3, offering the exchange of queens, it seems to me that black is still in reasonable shape. Probably white would have gone for rook d1 in this case, protecting the bishop on d3, intending to activate the king. There's only one weakness on d5, and once black is going to bring its king to the center, I really doubt that white is able to squeeze anything from this really small edge he has here. But Nepo decides to keep the queens on the board. And it's difficult to say what white exactly should do, but he's looking for ways to create new weaknesses. So the next move of Fabi here is a4, with potential ideas of trying to push the b-pawn, b4, b5, and trying to open up a file on the queen side to attack these pawns. But the next move of black is excellent. He decides to play a5, placing the pawn on the dark square, and after queen d2, there is b6. So technically speaking, this is a small improvement for black, so that the pawns are on dark squares. They are no longer hindering its own bishop, but also white is not able to attack these pawns with that light squared bishop from d3. Rook b1. So here again, we see that Caruana is hinting at ideas to break through with the move b4. And therefore, black goes queen a3. So if you ever go b4, the pawn on a4 can just be taken. And we are still in a phase where both sides are maneuvering, not much is happening, but it's still a game. King h2. Useful move, black goes h6, and now white goes rook to b2. Excellent idea, with the idea to come with the rook to the c file, which was not possible with the rook on b1, as the queen also covers that square together with the rook. Therefore, rook b2, queen goes back to e7, and now rook c2. Finally, rooks are going to get exchanged. But black is willing to cooperate, but he wants to decide under which conditions. Rook on c5 is doing very well. After rook takes c5, it's b takes c5, attacking the knight, and therefore there is no time for white to capture the pawn on a5. That explains the move played by Fabi. He goes knight f3, and now rook takes c5 is a way to go for further simplifications, as b takes c5 is no longer possible as the pawn on a5 will be hanging. Black decides to take on c2. You cannot take with the queen because that drops the pawn on e3. Therefore, bishop takes c2, and now queen to c5. Still, it's a pretty balanced position, and with a lot of maneuvering coming up. But still, I would always take white here. There is always this long-term problem regarding that pawn on d5. Black decides to bring the king to the center, but then one move later he decides to come back. So he's just asking white, what are you going to do next? King g1, king f8, king f2. White brings the king to the pawn on e3. Black goes king e7, queen b2. Now the king goes back again. And now white goes knight c2. And I believe now we come to a very interesting moment, as the following move played by Nepo in itself, it's not a mistake, but it's a move which does change the character of play, and I believe from a human perspective it is a mistake. He decides here to play the move knight e4, allowing the move bishop takes e4, d takes e4. We have a new structure. White is no longer playing against the IQP, but pieces are getting exchanged, and this bishop is definitely worse piece than the knight, which is fantastically standing in the middle of the board on d4. White has a very nice grip on the situation here. Black goes bishop c6, queen e2, looking for a way to try to enter, queen c3. That's a good move. Queen a6, and here another critical moment, because I believe that black should try to look for counterplay, but how to generate such counterplay? Well, in the game, they followed the move queen d2, but probably it would have been more precise to keep the queen close to the pawn on b3. If you do give a check with the queen on b2, knight e2 is not a possibility, as the pawn on b3 will drop. You could drop back with your queen, but then you're not making progress. The queen on c1 basically prevents the white queen from getting activated. The attempt to run away with the king g3, can now nicely be met by the move queen d2. And this is a very difficult line. It's based on very precise calculation, as white can suddenly capture that piece on c6. Queen takes e3, and where do you go with the king? Well, for instance, if you go king h2, it's queen takes f4 with check, and there's no convenient way to get out of the check. If the king goes back to the back rank, it's queen c1 with a double attack, picking up the knight, and black is 2 pawns up. If you go g3, it's queen d2 check, the king got to go to the back rank anyway, and it's queen c1, and you're picking up the knight. Therefore, king g4, it's sort of the only move, and some crazy lines are happening, but after something like g6, white is absolutely unable to make any progress. There are all sorts of mating ideas with f5, or maybe queen f2 even. Apparently this is leading to a draw with correct play, but understandably, Nepo doesn't want to sacrifice a piece. He goes for the move queen d2, but now, from this moment on, things are going downhill for black. The knight comes back to e2, everything is nicely protected, and white threatens to take on b6. There are no really good ways to defend the pawn. If you go back with the queen to d8, it's knight d4, attacking the bishop, and there's no longer counterplay from the black queen entering on d2. Therefore, queen b4 played, defending the pawn on b6 in this way, but that allows queen c8. Double attack, black has only one move, bishop e8, and now, very nice idea, you would love to bring your knight to d4, but if you played it right now, it's queen d2 check, and you will have to come back with a knight to e2, so no progress. Therefore, white voluntarily drops back with the queen to c2, protecting the pawn on b3, and most importantly, on the next move, the knight will come back to d4, protecting the pawn on b3, and there's no good way of protecting the pawn on e4. It's a very difficult position, as that pawn on e4 is in fact a serious weakness. Black played here the move bishop d7, knight d4, and as you can see, queen takes e4 is a serious threat. Probably you should try to give up the pawn, because if you would play something like queen e7, I guess there is just queen c7, and then the second weakness, the pawn on b6, can be attacked. That's the problem. When there's only one weakness, your defensive task is relatively easy. Here, black is really in deep trouble. Black decided to play the move f5, but although the pawn is supported now, you're opening up your own king, and that offers new possibilities for the white queen. So the white queen happily enters. Now, the bishop is under threat. If the bishop goes away, it's knight e6, king g8, and checkmate. Therefore, queen d2, but now knight e2 again. Excellent move. You're threatening the pawn on b6. You cannot push the pawn because of take-take, queen c5, and here again, you see how vulnerable the black king is. Black decided to play bishop e6, but that drops a pawn. Queen takes b6, and it's a very difficult position as the pawn on a5 is vulnerable. Okay, it's still defended. Bishop is unprotected. There are too many problems to deal with. If you go king e7, for instance, white is happy to go queen d4, forcing the exchange of queens, and that's a technically winning endgame for white. White's going to bring up the king and create a passed pawn. So therefore, king f7, keeping the bishop and pawn defended, queen d4, and now, of course, no time to take on d4, because after knight takes d4, the knight protects the pawn on b3. Black has no chance to take. Black played queen a2, but now queen a7 check. King has to go back, and now very precise move, queen a8. Before capturing the pawn, we insert this check. It's very important. Wherever the king goes, either to f7 or h7, in the game king h7 was played, it's queen takes a5, and now there is no time to take with the bishop on b3, as that runs into queen takes f5 check. Obviously, you can still take with the queen on b3, but now knight d4 is an excellent move. You're threatening the queen, threatening the bishop. The pawn on f5 is attacked twice as well. This endgame should be lost. So you see, the problem is that the king is really badly placed. Nepo decided to go king h8, queen d8 check. The moves were repeated once, And only now white decided to push its b pawn. It's 2 pawns up, but there's a bit of counterplay. Look, it's bishop c4 now, threatening the knight, but Fabi had calculated very well. Gives a check on d8, king h7, and the queen comes back to d1. Excellent technique. Black has the possibility to give up the bishop for the knight, getting 1 pawn back, but after queen b2, this endgame with the idea to push the pawn is deadly lost. If you go queen b5, probably queen d4, intending queen c5 and push the pawn, should be lost. There's no counterplay for the black queen, as the king can always hide in the corner. There are not enough checks for black. And that explains why Nepo didn't want to give up the bishop for the knight. He went for the move bishop to b3, attacking the queen and the pawn, but now queen d7, attacking the pawn on f5. Bishop e6, queen b5. Very nice technique. Pawns are protected, and bishop c4 can be met once again by queen takes f5 with check. King h8 was played once again to avoid that capture on f5 with check. And now there are various ways of playing. Personally, I like the move king g1, just making sure that the king is going to be safe before you move the knight away. Fabi had a different idea. He played here the move queen c5, which is also perfectly fine. If you do take the pawn on a4, it's knight e4, and white is going to take over very soon with the queen and knight. It's a really strong duo, and as I mentioned already, the king is absolutely safe. And once again, bishop c4 is also not recommended because of queen f8, king h7, and this pawn on f5. It's hanging all the time. So black solved the problem with the pawn on e4 by playing f5, but then we see in all these lines the pawn on f5 is such a serious weakness. Therefore g6 played, but then again the black king is getting more and more opened. White would love to get the knight involved and therefore played here the move king to e1. That's a very interesting idea. You're not afraid for any checks. You can always try to block it with your queen or knight, or try to run away via the dark squares. And if you go queen takes a4, by the way, it's queen e5 check. So here again, it's another double attack winning the game. Therefore, king g8 was played, but now queen d6, keeping the pressure on the bishop. If bishop c4, then you see the pawn on g6 is gonna drop. King f7, protecting the pawn, and now queen d2. White is getting lower on time, played this move with only 18 seconds left on the clock, tried to play it safe, giving back 1 pawn, but now the knight is joining the action. Bishop c4, king f2. Typical dark square strategy, trying to deal with his light squared bishop. Black played h5. Maybe in certain cases white is also able to play g4, trying to open up the king's position any further. Therefore h5, but now the king comes to g3. Certain cases the king can even come in, but there's no need to try to finish the game off in this way. After queen a3, there followed the move b5, and that's an excellent idea because the b pawn is going to distract black's forces. Black played here queen d3, which is a tricky move because if you do accept the invitation to exchange queens, all of a sudden black is going to hold this probably, because even if you go king f2, the d pawn is unstoppable. This is something you should never play. Instead, keep the queens on the board. Queen c1 is an absolute killer move. It's a very nice idea. You keep the pawn on e3 defended. Secondly, the big threat is just to run with the b pawn. And if you take the pawn on b5, which was played in the game, it's queen c7 check, and wherever the king goes, you're going to lose the bishop. King f6 runs into queen b6 check, and it's a double attack. You're winning the bishop, and after king g7, it's knight takes b5, your piece up, and the pawn on e3 is defended as well. In the game, there followed king f8, but now it's queen c5, and it's time to resign. It's a double attack, and you're going to win the bishop anyway. So a fantastic technical performance by Fabiano Caruana, who said he was very happy with the quality of his play in this game. And therefore, with this victory, he is taking the sole lead. He is on +2, 3 out of 4. In this field, that's a huge score. So let's see what is going to happen in the next 5 rounds. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and I will see you back very soon again. Bye bye.